What's the best example of survivor bias? People who survive some sort of disaster like an earthquake, an attack, or whatever, and then saying that they had the will to survive and that's why they were able to make it out. I'm pretty sure like 99% of the victims that didn't make it also had the will to survive, but the universe is random and shoved a metal beam through their chest. After steel helmets were introduced in World War I, the amount of head injuries increased sharply. When higher-ups were considering scrapping the helmets as a result, it was soon pointed out that these injuries would have been fatal if the men were still wearing cloth caps. From Gen X here, grew up in the country. My Facebook is filled with, "We didn't need no seatbelts as a kid," and "We used to ride in the back of the truck and we're fine. Frick those pansies." Yes, I rode in a car without seatbelts. Heck, most of the cars we rode in didn't have them. And yes, we rode in the back bed of the trucks, looking up over the cabs, going at 60. And yes, I remember riding with adults that chugged Coors Light as they drove a truckload of hay and just didn't think it was odd. You know what? A lot of the kids who did that crap died. That's why you're not going to get anyone arguing on Facebook. They're dead. I think the best example of the bias is just asking old people how they lived so long. You don't learn anything. "Well, my kids slept on their stomachs and rode around in the front seat of the car with no seatbelts, all before their first birthdays, and they were fine." When I was a kid, my grandparents went to take me out somewhere and my mum went to hook my car seat up in their car. Her father lost it, ranting and raving for a few minutes, and then my mum finally said if you don't put him in the car seat, you don't get to take him out. End of discussion. He relented, we drove about a mile up the road and then he pulled over and took me out of the car seat. I told my mum afterwards, not to tattle, but because I thought it was cool to ride in the big boy seat and I never drove anywhere with him again. Yeah, I think the thing that annoys me so much about this one is that Gramps actually had to go to extra effort to have his little act of defiance and endangered his kid and achieved nothing. What a stubborn moron. Whenever you hear people talking about how refusing to give your possessions when robbed at gunpoint is the best option, the people who this didn't work out for aren't here to tell the tale. If someone tries to kidnap you at gunpoint, however, you're apparently much more likely to survive if you run evasively instead of complying. If they end up shooting at all, then the chances of them hitting and the chances of that shot being fatal are apparently much smaller than the chances of them killing you after the kidnapping. This does, however, assume that there's people in range to hear the gunshots. If they can just fire at you without repercussions, then they only really have to wound you enough to capture you afterwards. Well, my grandma is a smoker and she lived to be 80. My mum is an active smoker. She turned 77 this year. My dad was an active smoker and he would have been 81 this year, but he died at 52 from lung problems. I don't smoke. Terminal illness, namely the big C. Essentially, if nothing else gets you, the big C will. So for every disease you successfully treat or prevent, the greater the likelihood the person will die of the big C. As we learn to cure more diseases, the rate of death by C word will go up. Smoking reduces incidence of Alzheimer's disease for the same reason. Abraham Wald and the missing bullet holes. In World War II, mathematicians were tasked with how best to armor planes. Since extra plating added weight, they wanted to use as little as possible by analyzing the bullet holes on planes that returned, and only to armor the places that got shot the most. Wald noticed that almost none of the planes they looked at had bullet-type holes in the engine area, and realized that planes that get shot in the engine even once will be destroyed. Since they were only analyzing the planes that came back, nobody else had even considered the planes that didn't make it back. So they just put extra armor around the engines and the planes were much more resilient. Autism. Nobody ever had autism before vaccines. No, people with autism were just labeled as retarded and locked in the shed. I once got a jar of cherry-flavored jelly beans from a friend as a congratulation gift. She was super thrilled about it and explained that she had seen that I always have a little jar of cherry-flavored jelly beans on my desk, so obviously they were my favorite, and wasn't she clever for figuring it out? I didn't have the heart to explain to her that the reason the jar had a buttload of cherry jelly beans in it isn't because I like them, but because I hate them and they're the only flavor out of the multi-packs that I buy that I won't eat. Similar. I worked in a deli and there were always sesame seed bagels left towards the end of the day. So many. So when I wanted to make a sandwich for the day, I would always use sesame, because I didn't want to take away from the more popular flavors so the customers could have them. My friend noticed and would always bring me the sesame bagels, saying how she knew they were my favorite. I never told her because it was so sweet she was thinking of me. Everyone share this post if you rode in the bed of a truck and turned out fine. Everyone who didn't turn out fine is too dead to say so. Safety equipment. I'm a car guy and a relatively new parent, 3-year-old and a newborn. The amount of older people who say, I was just fine without 20 airbags, or why the heck is he in a rear-facing seat at 2.5? They forget to add the part where they weren't in any car crashes or at most low-speed ones. Just because you made it through fine doesn't mean that improvements aren't needed. All the relationship advice you get, especially on Reddit relationships and things like that, it's all purely anecdotal. Oh, don't worry, honey. I married my significant other after just having dated 3 months, and we're still going strong 8 years later. Follow your heart. Like, okay, good for you, but generally speaking, it's not a good idea to marry someone after 3 months, and you never see the countless stories of people that did that and ended up bad. I never believed in love at first sight until it happened to me. Turned out the guy was a total butthole and I got my heart broken. Not entirely sure if this is the same, but the argument that older furniture, especially mid-century modern, was better than today's. I'm an amateur furniture maker and I've been reading up. I like the Mission style. It became popular in the early 1900s because it was handmade and was better quality than the mass-produced garbage that was becoming commonplace. This was over 100 years ago. We keep going through cycles of the same thing. In college, when I was a junior, in engineering, they brought a couple of people to tell us about their internships and how they got them. They talked for 10 minutes each on their experience and why they recommend it, among other things. And yes, we all know it's good to get an internship, the money, the practical experience, resume booster, contacts, among other things. Neither of these people said a word about how they got it though, which was kind of the point of going to the seminar. So many of us in 2008 and 9 were having trouble finding internships, so I was hoping to get some insight, an avenue I hadn't considered before, that kind of thing. Afterwards, I asked them, so can you tell me about how you landed these? Was it career fair, applying online, that kind of thing? The girl said, well, my uncle works at that plant, so… And the guy said, my dad knows a guy who worked there, and he recommended me. Damn. Well, the narrator knew that nepotism happens in all fields, but he'd just kind of hoped that it might be a little less prevalent in a field so dependent on actual skill and knowledge, like engineering. Gosh darn it. Post-traumatic stress disorder. We think it's so common today and that it also used to be so common, but past people just didn't have any awareness of it. And while lack of awareness in the past was one reason it's so much more prevalent today, another reason is that past traumatic things used to just kill people so much more often than they do today. Medical science has enabled so many people to survive horrible events. Now people have PTSD, whereas once they would have just come down with a bad case of dead. All available science shows that expectations of what counts as normal or endurable do make an impact, but yeah. A lot of the idea that Grandpa didn't get no PTSD despite seeing all of his friends die in front of him while fighting Krauts in heavy combat for 3 years, god darn Vietnam syndrome and modern millennial snowflake military telling everyone they're special and broken and entitled. That's all horse crap. Grandpa probably got really messed up and just did his best to hide it. Same with most people now who have the symptoms. And in most historical eras, things that tend to produce PTSD were so common that it just wouldn't have been remarked on at all. Grandpa also lived at a time when it was socially acceptable to have your first drink of the day at like 9 a.m. after you finished your breakfast cigarette. All the music from a given decade is so much better than music nowadays. Well, yeah, because we don't remember the bad music from back then, because it was bad. We don't play it anymore. Only the good music from the past is still played today. However, bad new music is being experienced right now in the present as it's being released. Time has not yet weeded out the bad music from nowadays because it's still nowadays. You ever see a beautiful building from the 1800s and think, wow, houses back then were so much more beautiful and built better than today? That's because all the ugly and poorly built buildings from back then were torn down and made way for newer buildings. In Mexico, they started a few years ago a campaign to report common crimes, and guess what? Crime statistics went up. Who would have thought? Famous people acting like they succeeded just because they worked harder than everyone else and not because of any factor of luck. All the people who worked really hard and still didn't become rock stars would be able to tell you that there's no guarantee of success, but they can't tell you that because they aren't famous. The whole, giving birth has happened for millions of years, it's a natural process and I don't need any medical interventions at all, argument. For millions of years, women and babies have also been dying when giving birth. Yeah, the amount of women and babies that died during births was no joke. Everyone complains about the number of stepmoms in fairy tales, but it was just so common back then that when the first wife died giving birth, you just married another one to help manage the house and kids. In 1850 in Finland, 1,400 out of every 100,000 births resulted in death. Now, it's only 3 out of 100,000, and that's just coming from data that's being collected in the 1800s. There's no telling how many women died previously. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below, and if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. You know that early 20s feeling when you don't know what you're doing with your life and have so much riding on your decisions to determine your success 20 years down the road? Yet you look back at your family and friends and wonder how they all had their crap together and were functional, stable families in their 20s? You don't understand how you're struggling so much on the edge of failure but they were able to do it so easily with very little failure? Yeah, that bias. When people say that ancient civilizations like the Romans or Egyptians were way better at construction than us, a large reason why they think this is survivor bias. You see the ruins of some structures, but not the 99% of all other structures built that didn't last from the time. Not to mention the fact that a lot of those structures, they had unlimited resources to build. Also, we now design things for a certain useful life. A lot of buildings are around 50 years life. This is because it doesn't make sense for a business to invest resources for longer design life. The productivity cult. Not that productivity to a point can't be good, but people being pointed to probably aren't succeeding because they do those super productive things. They'd be successful anyway because of who they are. Wearing a single type of clothing to save time, like Zuckerberg, might help a bit, but he's successful because he had the smarts and money to get into Yale and study CS. Wearing hoodies isn't going to take a guy with a community college education and make him a millionaire. Hoodies are nice though. Why do we need vaccines? Nobody dies of polio or smallpox or measles anymore. Why do we need NATO, the UN, or the EU? Europe doesn't get into large wars anymore. Nostalgia and memories. No one wants to remember all the crappy parts of their childhood or growing up, and we as humans specifically try to forget those moments. Everyone is so nice and helpful, say all attractive people ever. I would say evolution. So many people just can't wrap their heads around the actual evolutionary process. A popular mantra on Reddit is along the lines of, every single ancestor of yours has successfully procreated for the last 3.6 billion years. I mean, yeah, no crap. When I hear people marvel about how well-fitted together ecosystems are, it's sort of a half-truth. What's true is that the species we have now, as of the present moment, are whatever current iteration of species are best suited to filling ecological niches, relatively speaking of course. But that sort of glosses over how much failure has happened along the way. In the billions of years from prokaryotes on, way more gene mutations resulted in species that were not suited for ecological niches, and they died. Or the species that once had a niche were rendered obsolete by changes in surface temperature, precipitation patterns, sea levels, ocean chemistry, new predators, a loss of food source, among other things. What we have currently are the very few species that didn't die off, which is what most species throughout history have ultimately done. Died. Yeah, I recently started to read into what an absolute crapshoot the evolutionary process is. Most things don't make it, and a bunch of them can start to make it, and would have made it a lot longer if not for a sudden fluke in whatever area or time they were living in. We're just lucky that we didn't get a big enough mega eruption or freak meteor in our most recent millennia. Why do we need a security system? No one has ever broken in. That was an actual statement from my boss. Whenever people say, Saturday Night Live just isn't as good as it used to be, I mean, it was always hit or miss, you just end up remembering the good skits. I've watched just about every season of SNL I could get my hands on, and it's been consistently hit or miss, if that makes sense. If I had to guess, for every great skit, there's about 5 bad or meh skits. Some episodes have been funnier than others, but there's no official peak, at least in my opinion. There were always going to be good and bad cast members, there's always going to be good or bad hosts, and there's always going to be good skits and cringy ones, and that's why I love it. I've watched SNL since the early 90s and have gone and watched older episodes on DVD. I think the biggest thing is that it seems like modern SNL has gone more political than before. Also, it seems like older SNL was okay with a weird skit being weird and not having an explanation. Though I do agree that it's always been hit and miss, I think some people just tire more quickly of political jokes and dismiss them. Dolphins have been known to help swimmers in distress by pushing them towards shore. Probably, they push swimmers in random directions, but the ones they pushed out to sea didn't live to tell about it. They don't make cars like they used to. And that's a good thing. Older cars were metal death traps with little to no safety features. People have this skewed idea that older cars were built better. The truth is, modern cars are faster, safer, and a heck of a lot better for the environment. Medical anything: appendicitis, broken bones, irritable bowels, losing or gaining weight, pregnancy, and my favorite, cancer. When I had cancer, my doctor said ABC, and my naturopath said XYZ, and I XYX'd and I was fine. Yeah, your mole removal really compares to stage 3 colon cancer. Chest cancer is the absolute worst for these kinds of people. Yeah, the saddest part of this is it's actually killing people. My mum saw a patient at a chiropractic office who, when the chiro took an x-ray of his back, noticed a spot on his lung. He went and got it checked out, and sure enough, cancer. It was in such an early stage, he didn't even have symptoms yet. He was 30 years old with a wife and young kid. The fact that he just happened to get an unrelated x-ray should have been the miracle that saved his fricking life. But did the guy listen to his doctor and do the crap he was supposed to be doing? No. He went the homeopathic route, started juicing and stopped eating meat because apparently they think eating meat causes cancer. A year later, his cancer is now untreatable and he fricking died. Widowed his wife and left his young kid fatherless because he believed some crap like eating better was going to cure him by itself. Listen to your doctors, kids. People who are really good with money usually don't stay poor their whole lives. I was actually the one using this in an argument, and someone argued against me saying that this was survivor bias, and I just kind of went, crap, they're right, and I conceded. Just because usually only people who are good with money become rich, it doesn't mean that everyone who's good with money becomes rich. Using seatbelts significantly increases the risk of dying with cancer. The incel movement. The people who grow as a person and get to the point where they can get a girlfriend leave the scene, and everyone who remains is still spouting the same old crap. Most shark attacks occur in shallow water near the shore. No crap, that's where people are. It's like saying that most car accidents happen on the roads. Sharks don't suddenly get docile when they're in deep water. I made enough money working in the summer to pay for my college. Ugh, I heard that from so many older family members when I was in college and said I needed to take out loans. You look them right in the eye and say thank you for fricking it up for the rest of us. I'm 50 and I remember when I was 12 or 13, a guy who worked construction painting jobs during a summer, and he would literally pay his tuition and spending money for the year. He was 19 or 20 at the time. Cost of attendance today at a public school is $30,000 to $40,000. How in the frick would anyone make that kind of money in 3 months without dealing substances or trafficking working girls? I mean, Jesus, are older people who went to college just that stupid and incompetent in math? Anyone who went to college and says this is a perfect example of how college prepares idiots. I was finally able to graduate at 46, and I'm grateful for the education, but it was one of the most self-destructive things I've ever done financially. Like, empirically stupid. My heart once again goes out to everyone who doesn't live in a country where you get reasonable student loans or even free university. The system is really stacking itself against you guys. Or at least against your citizens who aren't born into rich families. I tried talking to my OB-GYN about getting my tubes tied and she instantly refused, saying I should wait until I've already had at least one kid or I hit my mid-30s. I tell her I've never wanted kids and I'm sure of that. She said, I hear too many stories of women who get their tubes tied before having kids and end up coming back regretting their decision and asking for a reversal. That's because you're not going to hear about all the women who don't come back asking for a reversal. It would bother me less if my brother-in-law had to go through the same thing when he went in for a vasectomy at age 25. Music. Most people only remember the hits, not the thousands of duds that accompany each hit. While there's more bland, safe crap out there than ever before, the fact that it's so easy to make incredible music in a huge variety of genres makes me think we're actually in a second golden age of modern music. People will say, "My parents hit me and I turned out fine," as a reason to hit their own children. Psychological science is increasingly showing that physical discipline does more harm than good, and just because one person turned out okay doesn't mean we should ignore the scientific evidence saying otherwise. Guys from bad neighborhoods describing their neighborhoods as good ones. For a common person, it's extremely unlikely to get robbed, murdered, or the unspeakable act in a bad district. You can live there for 5 or 10 years without something ever happening to you. It's another story for families. If you move in there with 3 children and your wife, the chance for something happening to one of your family members is likely. Psychiatric and neuropsychological disability. We see people who are successfully managing psychiatric disabilities of varying severity and assume that everyone can be helped with enough resources and support. We don't see those who are too disabled to function in a community setting, even with extensive treatment, and many people are unaware of how many mentally ill people are incarcerated. This is problematic because it creates the illusion that adequate treatment options exist for everyone, and allows blame for unmanaged disability to be shifted to the patient and their family, and prevents awareness of the need for greater funding for research and treatment. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.